Okay, we are live.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking time from your schedule or including us in your schedule to join us for this program, Is This Who We Are? Assessing the Assault on the U.S. Capitol. I am Ken Clarke, Director of the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights, which is sponsoring this program. I share this virtual space today with 4 colleagues who will respond to the question in the title of this program. Inaudy Esposito, Executive Director of the Orange County Human Rights Commission. Leslyn McBean-Clairborne, Chair of the Tompkins County Legislature. Jody Miller, Executive Director of the Dutchess County Human Rights Commission. And Deborah Howell, Director of Information Technology Operations for the Cornell University Libraries. She is also an Army Reserves veteran. You will hear from each of them shortly. January 6, 2021 was for many Americans a day of infamy. We saw what seemed unthinkable: the assault on the US Capitol by an angry, armed, amped up mob that tried to prevent Congress from confirming the results of the 2020 presidential election. Hundreds of individuals overcame Capitol and Metropolitan DC police to break into the building. A noose, the vicious symbol of lynching, was hung in front of this building erected by slaves. Rioters carried signs and placards with racist and anti-Semitic messages. Windows were broken, doors were breached, congressional and Senate offices were ransacked. The Speaker of the House of Representatives and the Vice President of the United States were sought out by some of these assailants for special harm. Lawmakers were escorted to safety, fearing for their lives, some of them making what they thought were their last phone calls to loved ones. A DC Metropolitan policeman was pinned between a door and his riot shield by the assailants, but survived. 5 people, 4 rioters and a Capitol policeman, did not survive. And more than one commentator noted the difference in the manner in which law enforcement dealt with these 2021 rioters in comparison to peaceful Black Lives Matter protesters on streets nearby the Capitol in 2020. One of the responses, particularly among pundits and politicians, to the disconcerting images at the Capitol was, "This is not who we are." January 6th was treated as an aberration. But is that true? America is no stranger to political violence. The signs and placards of the insurrectionists reminded us that political violence has historically been driven by racism and bigotry. Brent Staples in a New York Times opinion piece reminded us that W.E.B. Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, Richard Hofstadter, among others, have well documented this ugly past, which, as William Faulkner wrote, is never really past. The mob assault on the Capitol was an outgrowth of what came before, Staples wrote. He said that the January 6th riot occurred in the wake of a presidential campaign in which majority Black cities in the country were portrayed as hotspots for voter fraud that, in fact, did not exist. The violence of January 6th also reflected what the author Anand Giridharadas has called a revolt, against the future, the changing demographics of America. America is transitioning from a society in which whites are the predominant demographic and Christianity is the pervasive expression of faith, to an increasingly multi-ethnic and multi-faith society. This change is due in part, if not significant measure, to the landmark Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which ended the racist national origins quota system in place since 1924. So the question remains, is the tragedy of January 6th who we are? It begs also the question, indeed, who are we? Our panelists will speak to the first question, starting with my colleague, Inaudy Esposito.
Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate being here. Good afternoon, everyone, to my fellow panelists, to everyone who's watching. My name is Inaudy Esposito. I'm the Executive Director for the Orange County Human Rights Commission, and it really is an honor to be a part of this conversation. To answer, is this who we are, in response to the occurrence of the insurrection that occurred earlier this month, is a challenging question, because the answer, I think, depends on who you ask. I think that for a very long time, we've struggled with coming together. We've struggled with, defining ourselves as a nation. And I think that's part of the challenge. I mean, this country was in a civil war in 1861 because of the question, who we are, right? If we think back to how we got to where we are today, we think about the fact that we have been divided for a really long time. Some would argue from the beginning, we have been divided. And I think it's important to remember that that is a result of who we are as a nation because of our democracy. That is a result of being able to have, the beauty of freedom of speech, the beauty of, have our own feelings, our own opinions, so it's important that when we talk about who we are, that we understand that, yes, for many people, that is who they are. For some, it is not. When I look at, I'm going to share a quick image of, an image that came directly out of the insurrection. When I look at that picture and we ask ourselves, is that who we are? I personally would say, nope, not who I am, and not, the flag that represents my country, not the, face that represents who I am or, my people, right? But for many, it is. And we have to acknowledge that. We have to understand that when we ask the question, we need to understand who's the we that we're talking about. Because in order to be able to move forward, in order to be able to come together and unite as it's being asked, we need to have real conversations, because this is who I am, right? When I think of the question, who we are, I think of the words by the incredible Amanda Gorman. I've asked myself a million times, where has she been all my life, right? She said something in her poet, and I really hope that the listeners and everybody on the call got a chance to watch her. And if you haven't, please find her. But there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So when you ask me if this is who we are, this is the picture that I think of. I think of, the movement. I think of, the decades and the hundreds of people and thousands of people and activists who have been fighting so hard for equity, equality, for their voices to be heard. And we're nowhere near there. So if in 1861, we were fighting to figure out who we were as a nation, and in 2020, we're still asking for lives, Black lives, to be recognized as being valuable, then we need to have the real conversation of how is it that we got to where we are today, right? Because as exciting as it is to talk about healing and moving forward, we cannot do that without processing the pain, the loss of hundreds of years of injustice. We cannot do that without learning and unlearning so much that we as a community and as a nation have inherited and know to be true, or think to know to be true. So the conversation is wider. The conversation is, how do we come together to figure out, right? The new buzzwords is, how do we find common ground, right? So there's truth to all of that. There's truth to healing. There's truth to finding common ground, but there's also truth to pain. There's also truth to inequity. There's also truth to my voice doesn't matter as much as someone else's voice based on our skin color, or based on our religion, or based on our age, our differences, right? So I think it's about coming together and having conversations like these, but being frank about, yeah, that's who they are. They are part of us. They are my neighbors. They are my family, right? They are my coworkers. They are the people I break bread with. They are we, right? How do we find the space to figure out, how do we have conversations so that we can have the real talk about processing what we've been experiencing, processing the realities of our country in a way where we don't erase it, where we don't act like it never happened, but most importantly, where we don't act like it's not still happening till today. With that said, this conversation, I think, is incredible because it gives us the space to ask questions. It gives us the space to bring our thoughts and our ideas to the table, in finding the commonalities within our differences, in figuring out how do we get to where we need to be, but understanding that that will take decades, as it has been, right? No movement has ever happened so quickly, but at least we're having the conversation. And that's why I'm really excited to be here. That was my timer. I need to time myself so that I don't go on and on. Because, I think many of us on this call are capable of doing that, including myself. But I am really excited to be here and part of this conversation and listen to what everybody else has to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Inaudy. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Thank you for inviting me to participate, and thank you to the rest of the panelists for joining in as well. Is this who we are? And Inaudy, thank you so much for those images. The image of the gentleman with the Confederate flag is one that we looked at over and over again, and we've seen it. And this past Saturday at our GIAC MLK breakfast, we had that image, projected from our keynote presenter. And it's interesting that when I think of, is this who we are? I'd like to say, no, it isn't. But the reality is, and I pick up from where you left off, Inaudy, it is. And it's unfortunate that it continues to be. Our speaker on Saturday spoke of the inescapism of systemic racism and inequalities. We can't bury it. We can't mute the conversation or the realities of systemic racism in our community. So when we see that image, we know that it exists. And unfortunately, in the last, I don't know how many years, and even more so over the last 4 years, it has gone from being a little more clandestine, although still very present, to being forward and public and in your face. Here we are. White supremacy is on the rise. And this insurrection at the Capitol was just another bold presentation that we are here. This is what we do. We are part of the fabric of the American society, and we have been emboldened to show up and show out like that and let folks know that, yes, this is part of who we are. Now, we may not agree with it. It was jarring to see, a gallows and noose that was erected. Like, people had time to do this. And that's because they knew that it would strike a certain amount of fear in the community, and especially for Black folks, for Black people. They know that it will do that. And that's the idea behind having, things like this. I think back of insurrection, and I think of, John Brown and the work he did, and then, he certainly got executed hung for the work he did for the his abolition movement. He's leader in the abolition movement. Granted, his tactics were a little, uncanny, but it was a movement based on fact. Slavery, it was factual. It was happening. What happened at the Capitol was based on lies, not facts. And it was done to instill fear and to show we have power and to keep this country divided, to keep us divided. We have to be looking over our backs. We all applauded when Bree Newsom climbed that flagpole in South Carolina and snatched what she called snatching hate out of the sky, took down that Confederate flag, and we've been asking, laws are being passed to remove it. States are doing it. But the folks who feel differently, who showed up at the Capitol, want us to know that this is our history. We're going to keep it live, and we don't care who suffers, who is punished when we keep our history alive. Is this who we are? In my book, not really. In reality, yes. And we have to face that. We cannot just sweep it under the rug and say this was one incident. That's the reality of America. We set the standard for the rest of the world of what it means to treat people unequally, unjustly, unfairly, and to rain tyranny on people's lives. That's my start.
Okay. Thank you, Leslyn, and for your comments. And now we turn to Jody.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke, and my fellow panelists, for all our viewers today, for tuning in, for inviting me to this conversation. So I'd like to talk about this question from the experience, our experience, or my experience with the Commission on Human Rights since our commission was reestablished in 2016. This context both nationally and what we've experienced locally. I'm going to start with June 12th of 2016, the Pulse nightclub. During its popular Latin night, shooting happened. 49 people died, and an attack that was a direct targeting of the LGBTQ community. Fast forward to September of 2016, I received a call from someone who wanted to report that anti-Semitic flyers had been posted on telephone poles in her area. The person was deeply disturbed and had been taking them down whenever she found them. She sent me screenshots, and several of them blamed Jews for 9/11, something that I had never heard. Another person who had lived in that area for 25 years and who was Jewish said he had never seen anything like that in that area, and he was deeply alarmed and disturbed. In August of 2017, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia was held. More than 20 people were injured and 3 people were killed. Our commission, in collaboration with the Northern Dutchess NAACP and the Dutchess County Interfaith Council, held a dialogue immediately after that rally called 100 Cups of Coffee. And the purpose of that, responding to Charlottesville 100 Cups of Coffee dialogue, was to bring people together to process exactly what Inaudy was talking about, what had taken place and what its impact on them was, and what sense they were making of it, if any. So we asked people to talk one-on-one with 3 different people. And afterward, a white woman who had attended wrote about her experience talking with 3 different Black men. And she was particularly struck by what the last man said to her, which was that Charlottesville got so much media attention not because of the racism, which is what I, at the time, had been really focused on, and many others had been really talking quite a bit about. He said it was not because of the racism, but because of the anti-Semitism and the chant that Jews will not replace us was the reason that so much media attention had been put on that rally. And maybe some of us will remember comments from the president right after that was that there are fine people on both sides. He also confirmed that he was a nationalist. He said that. So moving forward to Sunday, October 28th of 2018, our commission held a listening session, which had been planned for several months. It was a Sunday, and it turned out to be the day after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting, where 11 people were killed while attending service, which was the deadliest attack on the Jewish American community in American history. Our listening session was being held in a local synagogue's community room in a rural part of our county. We had reports that a group who didn't agree with our work was planning to show up. They didn't agree with our human rights work, and they did. We had asked law enforcement to attend, given our heightened concerns. And at that listening session, people actually talked about their concerns about the rise of hatred that they were seeing in their community. One person said that on a recent Martin Luther King Day, a line of pickup trucks with Confederate flags drove down Main Street, and the person who was white, who was talking was white, saw that as a clear message of disrespect and intimidation and felt threatened herself every time she saw Confederate flags. That same week in Kentucky, 2 African Americans, Maurice Stallard and Vicki Lee Jones, were shot and killed while grocery shopping. And before the gunman shot them, he tried to first enter the First Baptist Church of Jeffersontown, a predominantly Black church where 70 people had been there an hour prior for weekly meeting service. And it is reported that the gunman had been overheard saying racist remarks. On August 3rd of 2019, 23 people in El Paso, Texas, while shopping were murdered. It was the deadliest attack in Latinos in modern American history. So why do I recount these examples, these horrific examples? I say them to point out the different identities and communities that have been targeted, the increase in violence over the last several years, and how do we put that together? Because the question is, is this who we are? And assessing the assault and how shocking it was, depending on who you ask, as Inaudy said. So a few years ago, I had the privilege to hear Eric Ward, who is the executive director of the Western State Center in Oregon. His organization's vision is for a just society where we flourish in sustainable, caring, and connected communities. And he's been writing and working against hate for several years on the West Coast, but his talk was very compelling. He talked about the impact of hate speech, hate incidents, and hate crimes on a community, and that the intention is to make people feel isolated and that they're under attack. It can have a chilling effect, so much so that people stop doing things, stop going places where incidents happened. They may stop participating in activities and events. And that one thing that really struck me about his talk was that groups that espouse hate are tapping into the bigotry that already exists, right? And you've already touched on that this is not new, it's become emboldened. And the intention of this social movement that uses the violence and intimidation tactics is to promote hate, is to become bigger and more powerful. And we heard about that building power. Leslyn, you mentioned that a few minutes ago. White supremacy and white nationalism is about building power. So just to recap a little bit about what we've seen over the last several years and in some of the examples that I gave both nationally and locally, the demonization and dehumanization of people who are not white or considered white. My timer. Amplification of that demonization and dehumanization in media and in policy. Permission to say what is already there, right? And being emboldened to act as a result of that permission. And lastly, accountability. Will there be any accountability? And the message, what's that message been? And it feels like that message has been, there won't be any accountability for speaking what's already there and now acting on it. So the hate that we've seen in the violence has been organized and amplified what has already been there. So it's not new. And our commission has seen this play out since 2016. And let me just wrap this up. I know I'm out of time. So the anti-Semitic flyers that I saw in September of 2016, resulting by 2019, we had a Nazi flag hanging in a bedroom window in Poughkeepsie. In 2020, swastikas on a college bench, on signposts throughout the community, and a person in a retail setting told someone at the end of the year they knew they could go buy it with their Jew money. They could go buy this thing. A sign that said Jews were responsible for the president losing the election. More than 50% of the reports that the commission has received have been about anti-Semitic speech or acts. A Confederate flag, different community, in a pickup truck parked in front of an African-American neighbor's house rather than in the person's own driveway. Black Lives Matter signs destroyed. A family in the LGBTQ community terrorized with symbols, letters, and flyers left on their lawn, that they don't belong and worse will happen to them. So in coming back to the title of this program today, is this who we really are? I think this is a question that white Americans may be asking, and it may be white Americans who must come full circle and look at, believe the lived experience and act to make changes that result in a just community for all. It requires coming to terms in all the ways that we have not been able to look straight at the injustice and hate of racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hate. That said, demonization and dehumanization is the worst of who we are. However, I also know that we have a completely different side, and that side, our humanness, is about being strong in self and connected to others. That's really how we're built. That's what we want, and that's how we are meant to be. I believe that we can realize the best of our human selves and look straight on and deal directly with the worst of our human selves. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. And now our fourth panelist, Deborah Howell, will give her remarks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Deborah Howell, and I'm bringing a veteran's perspective to this conversation. I'm a U.S. Army Reserves veteran. I'm also the mother of an active duty soldier currently. I do a lot of work in the veterans community and the military community, helping folks with deployments. And I want to be really clear that I'm bringing a veteran's perspective, not all veterans, because like many things in our country that we've seen in the last 4 years, the veterans community is divided on this topic. All of us stood up and took that same oath that President Biden and Vice President Harris took yesterday to defend our country against threats, both foreign and domestic. And to have a domestic threat has been challenging for so many of us, or to live through the last 4 years with the person who is supposed to be our commander in chief not being someone that a lot of us would want to follow. And the cognitive dissonance that's given many folks, and the collective trauma that we've all experienced, not just veterans, and how do we heal from that? I think it helped our community when some very well-regarded high-level leaders like General Mattis and like General Powell came out and said, they don't support this and we must do whatever we can to live by our morals. I've struggled with a lot of the misinformation that has been spread these last 4 years and continues to be spread now. And a lot of folks using the excuse that we shouldn't allow politics to divide us. And I really feel like this isn't a political issue. This is a moral issue. When we ask ourselves the question, is this really who we are? That's not a political question. Well, the personal is political, right? To quote the great woman. But this is a moral issue about who we are and who we want to be. as I was thinking about what I wanted to say today, some of that was altered by watching the inauguration yesterday and some of the relief I experienced as it happened peacefully and quite joyfully. I felt hope by the end. My husband cried quite a bit through the ceremony several times, and I did as well. And during the concert, this sort of collective sigh we felt. And I know she's already been quoted, but Amanda Gorman, I think, just represented so much of what we thought. And when she said yesterday, somehow we weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished, it really gave me a lot of what I feel like my heart needed to start having this conversation and to start moving forward and thinking about, how do we do that? We've been traumatized. Data and research from soldiers and from 9/11 shows that even witnessing images on television can give you PTSD, right? We don't know the after effects of what happened last week on people's mental health. And a lot of our mental health was already really strained or fractured from the last 4 years, from the 10 months in the pandemic, from losing people we love. And the incitement that happened last week, that 2 weeks ago, that allowed that to happen, that allowed people to think that was okay, I think was very damaging, and more damaging than we know. And I think we're going to be experiencing these effects for a lot longer than we think. So we had an inauguration and we're hopeful. But what do we do now? And as we ask ourselves, is this who we really are? I've had many conversations with my military community and within my own family. How do we put this nation back together? There's a lot on the shoulders of our new leadership right now, but I think it comes down to all of us, and I feel like one small person. And how does one person make a difference? And then I've been so inspired by Stacey Abrams in this election cycle. Blown away. One person. You think one person can't make a difference? Think about Stacey Abrams. And then I take that back to looking at Greta Thunberg, and then looking at Malala, and one person making a difference. And I think what I need is that fortitude, that energy. Where do I find that energy to do that? And the other thing that gets to me as I continue to think about this, is this who we are? Unless we can look right in the mirror and look at our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues and our family and say, yes, this is who we are, but we're not broken. We're simply unfinished and working towards who we want to be, and trying to do that. I've been thinking about, how do we, not just as a nation, how do we move to where and to who we hope to be as a nation? How do we put our families back together? How do we put friendships back together? Do we want to? And if we don't, how do we then heal the collective? I think it's a very big question, and I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. And I want to thank all of our panelists for their outstanding contributions today. We want to now hear from our online audience, your questions that you can submit to us, and to have our panelists address those. And I'll start off. I don't have anything in the chat as of yet, but I'll start off with a question, or at least I would say an elaboration on what Deborah said about this question being a moral question, and maybe some further elaboration on that in terms of how that impacts the work we do, either as human rights professionals, as as a member of the legislature, as a veteran. Maybe some further elaboration on this question, looking at it not just solely through a political or historical lens, but also a moral lens.
So some of what I find interesting there about the moral lens, as we think about this not being political, but it being moral, is I also teach a lot of leadership classes. And one of the things we like to say is that strategy eats culture for breakfast, right? So we can legislate, we can create strategies, we can do all of that. But until we really look underneath and address that moral issue, our culture is going to eat our strategy for breakfast. And some of that, I think, has to be in not giving up and not having the conversations. As if we look at the issues of racism in our country and trying to have those conversations, and how uncomfortable that has made people, and will continue to make people uncomfortable until they can get through those uncomfortable conversations. But also, it's an ugly word, and no one wants to be that ugly word. But until we can look at ourselves and say, I have racist thoughts, I am racist, I need to unlearn this, this came up and I need to think through it. I need help, I need to have a conversation, and taking personal responsibility for that, rather than expecting people to feed it to us or tell us how to act, right? Looking through that, but also being willing within our families and our friends, rather than starting internal wars, to really sort of with love have those conversations with each other and with patience. Because I know myself, I've not felt love or patience in many conversations. As I have, as I mentioned, the veterans community is split on this issue, supporting the former president and supporting what I see as a moral issue. And I myself have checked out of those conversations. I myself have gotten so angry, I think I can't do this, and I give up. And how do I not do that? And how do I also continue to do self-care so that I have the energy to do that? I don't have all the answers. I don't. But I do have a belief that that's where we start. We start with that brutal honesty, like that look in the mirror, self-assessment, and there's got to be some love in there and bravery in there.
I can just also add to that. When I think about the impact of some of the policies that have been passed federally, locally, in the last few years, what I like to consider, and when I have this conversation about how this is about moral and not politics, is helping people understand that it's really easy for someone with a privilege to say, well, that's politics, right? But for those of us who are impacted by those policies, by those thoughts, by the changes, it's not politics for us, it's our lives, right? When we talk about anti-immigrant sentiment, when we talk about LGBTQ laws and, homophobic things that have happened, when we talk about, earlier Jody talked about anti-Semitism, none of that is politics, right? We can't call it that because it's impacting people's lives individually and directly. And that's how I help people understand the difference between politics with policies and how this is really a moral conversation, right? We can disagree to pizza toppings, but we cannot disagree on the issues we're talking about, right? And that's quoting a meme that's out there on Facebook. That's in a nice way of putting it.
So I'm going to be an outlier for a minute. And, we live and we work and we are surviving in capitalist society,
Mhm.
society that's built on capitalism, but we want to have a conversation around systemic racism, around race and racism, from a moral lens. Getting those two things to marry each other is very difficult. Now, let me put it this way. The demographics of the United States of America, the world, is changing racially, ethnically. It is changing. And it's changing where, you know, people who identify as non-white or who are identified as non-white, people of color, are very soon going to be the majority. And that threatens white people who feel like they have the lock on the world, who feel like this is my space, like I am in charge, and where do you come from? So there's a threat with that happening. There's a threat to their prosperity when they see or imagine that with this growth in our demographics, that there is going to be Black prosperity or people of color, you know, being prosperous. It's a threat to their prosperity. That's the capitalism part of it. What we have to do in having those conversations, and Deborah, you're right, like we have to face things head on, is we have to, well, I'm not sure that we have to, but I'll say that one of the ways to go around this is getting those who feel that they are going to be most disenfranchised now because the demographics are changing, that they're going to lose wealth, they're going to lose all of these things. It's getting white people, in other words, to see that their interests lie in what I described on Saturday as cross-cultural solidarity. It's like we have to be working together. You have to understand that just because people of color and people who have been disenfranchised all their lives and people who have been marginalized are gaining something does not necessarily mean that you are losing something. We have to see that mutual interest. But it's hard to have to look at this from a moral lens when we live in a place that is driven by capitalism. That is difficult, a difficult conversation to have. The other thing that I wanted to point out real quickly, and I want to go back just a little bit about who we are and that image that still resonates in my head. You know, the fear for me of the Confederate flag and just seeing it, and you see it around town, people are bold and, you know, it's everywhere, you know, understanding that there is some historical significance to it, but there is also death and destruction of a race of people because of it. Now, the Southern Poverty Law Center, just to do a little bit more, talked about the increase in white supremacist groups during the Trump era. And most of it connected to the fact that their understanding is the changing demographics and the threat that comes with that. And so we have to beef up, you know, our groups. We have to be much more public because our very livelihood is being threatened, or so to speak. During the Trump era, from 2017 to 2019, white supremacist groups that were being tracked by the Southern Poverty Law Center increased by 55%. 55%. And anti-LGBT hate groups increased by, LGBTQ plus hate groups increased by 43%. Anyone who they considered non-white, so as you said, Jody, you know, people who are Jewish or Muslims, people who are of, you know, of color, of different descent, that's not what they consider pure white, is a threat. And our numbers are increasing, which means to them their wealth is decreasing, their status and power is decreasing. And so we see what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. And we saw that the people who, as you said, Deborah, who took that oath to protect and serve, and live up to the oath of the Constitution, were involved. We had police officers involved. We have active military involved. Now, where does that leave us? If the people who are supposed to protect and serve us are involved in this and see this as the thing that they should be doing based, again, on a platform of lies, but also, Mark, based on a platform of we are losing. Our power is being taken away from us. I'm getting on my soapbox. I'll stop right now.
Okay. There are a couple of questions from the audience I wanted us to get to. The first question is, and thank you all for your responses to the first question. I'd like to see what the conversation focus on what we here in Tompkins County can do about promoting change at the local level.
I'll just say a couple of thoughts about that. We have to have elected leaders speak out strongly and take action against white supremacy, white nationalist activity that is harmful, and certainly anything that breaks the law. Elected leaders have a responsibility and they have a megaphone, and they carry a tremendous amount of weight in terms of public opinion. And so we think that elected leaders need to speak out strongly against any of the things that we're talking about now that are harmful and certainly could be criminal. And local action on the ground in terms of pulling together your own group of people, the groups of people that you're working with across or working intersectionally with other groups, right? Because as Leslyn said, the threat of the global majority, another way, people of color, which are the global majority, we have to work intersectionally. It just can't be the Jewish group of people working, or, ideally, it would be best in all of our interests to be working intersectionally to make change. And there are many ways to make change. One of them, I've heard the word conversation many, many times. And so who are the people? Who needs to talk to whom about what? That's one question that we ask in the dialogue field. Who needs to talk about, in the transformative dialogue approach, is who needs to talk to whom about what? And so that might be talking to your own group of people. And because there could be a lot of difference. Deborah, you were just talking about the veteran community and how that's very polarized right now, as are many other communities. Just because you're within your own group, whatever that group, one identity group, doesn't mean you all agree, right? So who needs to talk to whom about what might have to do with, who within my own sphere do I need to talk to about this thing? Before, because dialogue is often thought about as intergroup, you're talking to a different group. Well, you might need to talk to yourselves first before you can talk to someone else. It's a decision, right? So those are just some thoughts from my perspective.
Other responses?
Yeah, if I can piggyback off of that, I'd like to see more than just denouncements and, speaking strongly against. I'd like to see the action, right? If our elected leaders, community stakeholders, or even community members are going to step up and step out against these issues, I want to see what they're doing, right? So things that we can do locally, we can, start creating more task forces to evaluate the lack of diversity in some of the leadership roles that we see. We can look at policies that have existed for decades in agencies, employers, local government, and see where do changes need to happen in these policies so that we can allow for more diverse voices to be part of it. We need to create committees that will assess the challenges that we have and make sure that those committees are formed with, number one, voices that have power to make change, and number two, voices that don't, but that understand the experience of the people that are being represented, right? So it's a multifaceted committee where we have all sorts of voices, but that also has the power. I can't agree enough with the conversation piece, because it needs to be redundant. It needs to continue to happen. One of the things that Orange County Human Rights Commission does is we have, for the last 4 years, constantly continued to bring information to the community, right? Information that wasn't available before, information that isn't easily accessible for everyone, but on all of the issues that we're talking about, right? All sorts of different social justice issues that include ageism, that include disabilities. How are all these things impacting the community with disabilities? How are, folks of different age impacted by discrimination in the workplace, et cetera? Because we need to be inclusive of all the groups that are targeted, that are discriminated against, both systemically, but also on an interpersonal level. So the more education we bring forward, the more people we will have. It's almost like creating this army of folks who understand the work that we need to do, but making sure that we then work together to allow for those resources to exist, so that we don't have movements that are just trendy based on a hashtag, that we don't have movements that are just, I'm going to black my screen out on social media today to show that I don't agree with something. Not agreeing with something is great, but how are we then using those voices? How are we then using whatever platform we have to create the real change that needs to happen, and not leaving it just for a few people or a few groups to actually make that change happen?
And then I think on a more, like on a smaller, more personal level, in addition to all of that, is to get out in your community, get out of your bubble. I know COVID makes this very difficult, but get out in your community and volunteer for a program you've never worked with before. Meet new people, learn new things. Also be receptive when someone is courageous enough to say to you, you didn't get that right. You didn't do that right. And to really pause for a second rather than immediately jumping to the defensive, and listening, right? Listening to the impact that you had and making some changes within yourself. I think we're very fortunate. I feel very fortunate to live in Tompkins County, and there are so many ways to get involved. And so try that, whether it's, adopting a food cabinet through the mutual aid food sharing community, or, trying a different church, or, volunteering for an arts program that you might not ordinarily do. Get out there and get a fresh perspective, and start changing things at home first, and let that flourish.
And I'll chime in quickly and say, I'm an action person. So one of the things, just as a real concrete example, following the breakfast we had on Saturday in honor of Dr. King, our keynote presenter, the video from that, we hope here at GIAC to put out and to keep it running throughout the year, so that folks can use that to engage around conversation, and do some more research. What did she mean when she said that? How am I? How are the things I'm doing manifesting in ways that reflect some of what she talked about, that are oppressing people? I think that's incredibly important. And I will go all out and say, we need to hold people accountable. People need to be held accountable and publicly accountable for not doing things. Yes, we understand when you're in a certain level of office, you try to be as circumspect as possible, because you can't just bring down the president. We've done that. We did it with Nixon when he did something wrong, If Mr. Trump has done something wrong, then we need to acknowledge it and we need to hold him accountable. You know, if anyone, and it doesn't matter who, I'm not just picking on Mr. Trump, but anyone who is perpetuating this sort of behavior and who is perpetuating what America has set as the standard for how we treat people differently and how we continue to move inequalities along, if people are doing this, we need to hold them accountable. And for those agencies and organizations that are saying that we want to change, it's time to really start digging deep, looking at your internal policies, looking around the room, seeing who was there, and how do I change that? And being bold about making those changes, not asking, or not seeing the one, person of color who's among your 35 employees, to come in there and be like you. Look at these large companies like, Starbucks. I was in the news a couple of years ago for how its employees treated Black customers. Look at what their top level administration looks like. And they all have these beautiful commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. But take a look, see who's at the top. And let's call them out on making those changes, because there are people of different ethnicities who are here and brilliant and can do that work, but the opportunities are not presenting themselves. So we need to be bold in our actions and force people to make the change that they need to make, and not one, not two. We always say, one is a token. 3, we're starting to get there. Have people around the table take action. When you open up a hire for a position and you realize that your entire candidate pool has zero diversity of any kind, it's time to sort of take a look again. Where did I advertise? Let me start this all over again, because you never know what you might be missing. Don't just have the statement. Put the statement into action.
Thank you. We've got time maybe for one last question and maybe some brief response to it. When addressing someone who is clearly racist, how can we do this without fear of being met with violence?
Well, I'll jump in. You have to assess your safety. That's the number one thing. On a daily basis, we all have to assess our safety, or even assess comfort level. When you are engaging in a conversation around racism or any of the tough topics that we've kind of touched on, you have to know your audience, right? It's not about changing hearts, changing minds, or changing an individual's opinion, in 20 minutes, in 45 minutes, even in an hour, right? It's about planting seeds. And if automatically from the beginning you feel a certain level of resistance and you get that gut feeling that something is in that conversation not going to go right, it's okay to walk away from it. It's okay to not engage in that conversation, because on a daily basis, people of color, LGBTQ folks, folks that are impacted by violence when it comes to their identities, they have to navigate the world around them and their safety. So I would never suggest having a conversation or pushing if it feels like it's going to end in some form of violence. With that said, assessing comfort, there's a difference between comfort and safety, right? It's okay to make people uncomfortable. It's what some of us get paid to do, right? Some of us have to do this on a daily, basis, and it's what we do. Helping that person understand the difference between discomfort and unsafe, right? And understanding that, yeah, some of this stuff is really uncomfortable to talk about, but if we can get past that discomfort, sit with it, it's okay to have these conversations while we're uncomfortable. And to remember that the reason that we are uncomfortable with this conversation sometimes, it's because our experiences are different from each other. My experience is different than your experience. And if I don't get it, I'm not going to really understand how to grasp it. But if I'm willing to have a listening ear, and if I'm willing to have empathy around the conversation, then my discomfort kind of eventually eases, goes away, or just kind of sits back. So always keep that in mind, the difference between discomfort and safety.
Well, Inaudy, Leslyn, Jody, and Deborah, thank you all so very much for your wonderful contributions to this panel and addressing the question of, is this who we are? We want to thank our online audience who joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you sometime next month for our monthly series of programs sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. Thank you all very much.